I remember it all too well, the day our world came crashing down. The day the unthinkable happened, and we were forced to surrender to the humans. It was a day that forever changed the course of our history, one that none of us on Tyrax will ever forget. The war with the humans had been the longest and most bitter conflict we had ever faced. By the time it was over, our fleets were nearly obliterated, and half of our colonies lay in ruins. But on Tyrax, our beloved homeworld, we were shielded from the worst of it. The fighting was always somewhere far away, in the distant reaches of the galaxy. We noticed the decline in trade, the condolence messages delivered to grieving families, but we had seen that before. War was part of our identity, and we had always defended our interests with unwavering determination. Life on Tyrax continued as it always had, our confidence unshaken. We believed the war would remain a distant threat, never touching our home. Even as the trade ships dwindled, and the number of grieving families grew, it never crossed our minds that we might lose. We were Tyriansa people who thrived in adversity. When times were tough, we fought back harder. Victory was always within reach, or so we thought. So, when the government announced that we were going to surrender, it was a shock that sent ripples through our society. At first, we refused to believe it. Surely it was a mistake, a miscommunication. Perhaps the humans were the ones surrendering, or maybe there was some kind of sabotage. But as the hours passed and more confirmations came in, the harsh reality began to sink in. We had lost the war, and surrender was our only option. The hours that followed were surreal. Life on Tyrax ground to a halt. No one went to work, no one attended school. People wandered the streets, dazed and disoriented, unable to comprehend how we could have fallen so far. For 1,000 years, we had never surrendered, never admitted defeat. Our military was the best in the galaxy, and the war with the humans had started so promisingly. We had wiped out an entire human fleet with our first strike and overrun their nearest colonies before they could muster a defense. We had every strategic advantage, yet here we were, on the brink of surrender. The humans had always been our mortal enemies, encroaching on our territory and supporting our foes. They were a species we despised, and we had believed them to be evil, ruthless in their pursuit of power. How could this be happening? How could we be surrendering to them? As the truth settled in, fear gripped our hearts. We knew what human occupation meant, or at least we thought we did. The stories from the outer colonies were terrifying. Mass executions, forced labor, daily beatings, and worse. Some chose to end their lives before the humans even arrived, preferring death to the horrors that awaited us. The government urged us to endure, to think of future generations, but the despair was overwhelming. Protests erupted across the planet, but they were quickly crushed by loyalist troops stationed at key locations. The majority of us were too stunned, too afraid to resist. We could only wait in dread for the humans to arrive. A month after the surrender was announced, the day we had all been dreading finally arrived. The human fleet appeared in orbit around Tyrax, their battleships darkening the skies. I watched in silence, my heart heavy with resignation. This was the end, and we would meet it with whatever dignity we could muster. The official surrender took place aboard the human flagship, broadcast live to every screen on Tyrax. We expected to see our leaders humiliated, forced to beg for mercy from our conquerors. Instead, they were handed a piece of parchment and asked to sign it, acknowledging the terms of our surrender. It was a strange custom, but one that signaled the finality of our defeat. There were no executions, no grand displays of power, just the simple act of signing away our freedom. Within hours, the first human dropships began landing, their troops fanning out to take control of our cities. I debated whether to hide or watch, fear warring with curiosity. In the end, I couldn't resist. I watched as tanks and armored personnel carriers floated down our streets on suspensor fields, followed by rank upon rank of human infantry, encased in powered armor that made them look like walking tanks. As I observed them, I realized how little we had known about our enemies, their technology, their discipline. It was all beyond anything we had imagined. Had we known, perhaps we would have thought twice before provoking them, but it was too late for regrets. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. A small child, barely more than an infant, wandered out into the street, directly in the path of the marching human soldiers. I held my breath, expecting the worst. But instead of trampling her or shooting her down, one of the soldiers broke ranks, gently picking her up and carrying her back to safety. He even gave her a small packet of food before returning to his place in the column. It was a moment that shook me to my core. This was not the behavior of a brutal, merciless conqueror. Perhaps, just perhaps, we had been wrong about the humans. As the days turned into weeks and then months, my fear began to give way to something else: hope. There were no mass executions, no forced labor camps. The humans set up checkpoints and took control of government buildings, but life continued. I still had my job as a minor government functionary, and I reported to work as usual, albeit with a sense of trepidation. When I finally met the human in charge of our department, I was surprised by his demeanor. He introduced himself as Doug, a name that was initially unpronounceable to me. He was polite, almost friendly, as he explained the new procedures we would be following. There was no talk of punishments, no threats, just a straightforward discussion of how we would be working together from now on. Over time, I got to know Doug and the other humans in the occupation government. They were not the monsters I had imagined. They were competent, considerate, and in some cases, even kind. I found myself growing comfortable in their presence, something I would have thought impossible just a few months earlier. And then, one day, it hit me. The surrender hadn't been the end of the world. It had been the end of the old Tyrax, the end of our arrogance and our blind hatred. But it wasn't the end of everything. We were still here, still alive, and perhaps with the humans' help, we could rebuild. Maybe we could even create a better world than the one we had lost. It was a hard realization to accept, knowing that all the lives lost in the war, all the destruction, had been for nothing. But as I looked around at the world we were beginning to build together, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The future was uncertain, but it was a future nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, we had been wrong about the humans all along.